for this moment than the one that we are about to address now. And that is, can addressing inequality unleash economic growth? With the biggest downturn since the Great Depression and the pandemic opening old historical wounds about racial inequality and wealth gaps, it is the question of the moment. And luckily, we are joined by an esteemed panel to not only help us discuss the problems, but rare these days, also address the solution. So here with me today is Professor Lisa Cook. She is a professor at Michigan State University of Economics and International Relations. Dr. Cook has conducted research in economic growth and development, financial institutions, innovation, and economic history. She served as a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors. Dr. Cook has also held or conducted research in a lot of notable institutions, including the National Bureau of Economic Research, the Federal Reserve Banks of Minneapolis, New York, and Philadelphia, the World Bank, Brookings Institution, Hoover Institution, among others. And she is currently director of the American Economic Association Summer Training Program. We also have with us today Jim Tinkersley. He is a tax and economics reporter for the New York Times, and he has covered over the last decade, politics and economics in places like Vox, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, many notable publications. He has also put his tenure of economic and political reporting into excellent use recently with the publication of his new book, The Riches of This Land, The Untold Story of American Middle Class. So thank you both for joining us here today. We thought we'd start out by letting our panelists give some introductory remarks. That'll be followed by about 20 to 30 minutes of moderated Q&A. And of course, it's the part of the panel that I always enjoy the most, the one where I get to ask my own question as an audience member. So we're going to leave some time for that. So with that, let's start with 5 minutes of introductory remarks from Dr. Cook, followed by Jim Tinkersley. Dr. Cook.
Thank you, Neela, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak to NABE this afternoon. In my research using patent data from 1870 to 1940, I find that barriers to entering the field of invention led to negative outcomes for individuals and for the economy. That is, not only were African-American inventors discouraged from participating in the field of invention, but all of us missed out on the free flow of ideas that undergirds innovation, higher growth rates, and higher living standards. Specifically, I find that this amounted to losing the same number of inventions as a medium-sized European country during that period. In macroeconomics, we are learning more about the historic misallocation of talent. Shea, Hurst, Jones, and Klenow in a 2018 paper analyzed gender and racial distributions for higher skilled occupations in the last 50 years. They show that a change in occupational distribution since 1960 suggests that substantial pools of innately talented women and African Americans in 1960 were a result of not pursuing their comparative advantage. So misallocation of talent, in their view, affects aggregate productivity in the economy. A quarter of growth in aggregate output from 1960 to 2010 can be explained by improved allocation of talent. My co-author Yan Yang and I find that GDP per capita could be 0.6% to 4.4% higher per capita, again, if more women and minorities participated in the innovation economy. Indeed, the evidence is mounting that addressing inequality can unleash the economy. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I think that's a good segue, Jim, to what your comments will be. Would you like to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank NABE and Neela and of course, Dr. Cook. I am just delighted to be talking to you about this topic because I feel very strongly about it. And I think it is one of the great emerging lessons of economic research in the time that I have been attending economics conferences, very rarely speaking at economics conferences. So this is a particular pleasure. I wrote a book, The Riches of This Land, about exactly the sorts of trends that Dr. Cook was just talking about. And I put it in a broader context. I started off trying to figure out what has happened to the great American middle class that we built after World War II. Why has it not continued to flourish in the way I think all Americans hope and expect that it will? And in fact, why have so many millions of Americans been left behind and not enter the middle class over the last several decades, including through the course of what are now two once-in-a-lifetime recessions just in the last 10 years. So I guess a little more than 10 years. But I started off with that question, what happened to the middle class? And the answer turns out to be a lot of inequality. Not so much about the inequality that so many politicians talk about the very rich and everyone else, but about the inequality of opportunity for, very bluntly put, white men and everyone else in this country, guys who look like me, who went to college, and everyone else. And it turns out, as Lisa was saying, that the research is very clear. We built an amazing, strong, vibrant middle class in the post-war era because we finally started to tear down many of the barriers that had, for generations, for the duration of American history, kept women of all races and men of color from contributing their full talents to our economy. In 1960, something like 19 out of every 20 American doctors and lawyers was a white man. And not 19 out of every 20 Americans was a white man, nowhere close to it. That's an incredibly inefficient distribution of talent. And so in the course of the opening opportunities of the war effort and its aftermath, and much more so in the hard work of civil rights, women and men of color started to rip down those barriers. They started to fight their way into higher, better paying jobs, into more education, more opportunity. Now, the good news is that what is a huge part of why we built that great middle class. The bad news is we didn't finish the work. And so we allowed those barriers to opportunity to reform, or in some cases, new ones to grow up over the ensuing decades. And today we are faced with both the challenge of an economy that's not nearly as productive as it should be, because so many people are still held back by discrimination, and whether that's overt or not in our economy and our institutions. But we also have the opportunity of this enormous storehouse of American talent that is just waiting to be fully realized, fully unleashed upon our country. And that when it does, I think the research is really clear, we can have the sort of productivity boom again that we had in the post-war era. And so that, I think, is the important racial and gender equality story that really does contribute to economic growth.
Thank you, Jen. What I like about the connection, we're going to be drawing a lot of lines between both of your research, is that you both go backwards to go forward. Jen, you go back to World War II and you start from there. Dr. Cook, you go back much further in terms of innovation. You are also an economic historian, and you talk very emphatically, even with the economics, you understand the emotion tied to violence and innovation in the late 19th century and early 2000, and your groundbreaking research showing that arc between African-American innovation at that time and violence. And it really sets the stage, especially this year, when so much of the social upheaval has also been tied to violence against African Americans. It sets the stage for this relationship between innovation and inclusion now. So could you walk us through that foundational work in terms of innovation and violence back in that time period?
Certainly I can. What I noticed in the patent data was that both Black inventors and all inventors in the US were living in the same place. They were living in the same place, but African-American inventors had moved to these places just like the other inventors, like the Midwest, the Mid-Atlantic region. And they were all motivated by ideas, by the notion that inventors had something to contribute to the economy. So they were highly mobile and they responded to incentives. If there were more engines that needed to be created, they had them ready. There were more light bulbs, they had them ready. So one thing that I found extremely interesting was that in 1899, 1900 to be precise, you see these trends diverging. You see them converging, but then you see them diverging after 1900. And it's really striking because they have so many of the same skills. Why would one set start doing something and others start doing something else? So what we see is a dramatic drop in the inventors and inventions among African Americans, and 1899 is still the peak per capita for African American invention. So it recovered a bit during the period of extreme violence. So the measures of violence I use are riots, lynchings, and segregation laws. So patenting started coming back a little bit, but then there was Tulsa. And then you don't see this full recovery. And again, using 2010 data, 1899 still turns out to be the peak per capita for African Americans. And like I said, this turns out to be a tragedy, not only for those people who lost their livelihoods, but also for the economy. And this is equivalent to a small, medium-sized country, European country. And during that time, think about it, some of the most best-known inventions of our time were created during that period. The gas mask, that was Garrett Morgan. The street light, that was also Garrett Morgan. And he was absolutely adept at changing his method of being and operating to adjust to growing consumer side discrimination. He pretended to be a Native American chief. He pretended to be, or he had white men pretending to be him to sell his gas mask. He knew that once anybody found out that a Black person was the inventor, that the sales would fall. And he had an experience with this after a tragedy under Lake Erie, this big accident under Lake Erie. His picture appears in the paper with his brother and the gas mask, and Southern fire departments canceled these orders. So he was really adept at trying to make sure that his ideas got out there, that the commercialization of his invention got out there. But think about who actually took it up. The British. The British bought the gas mask and started testing it in the field for World War I, before and during World War I. So while we were over here playing around and making sure that this wasn't disseminated, this life-saving device wasn't disseminated, the British were trying to figure out how it could save lives. So that's what I mean by unleashing the economy. We can do this, and we've seen it before. And like Garrett Morgan, we can be resilient, but we can also figure out ways to channel positive energy and make sure that everybody can participate in the innovative process.
I love that you're already leading the way to solutions. I'm going to stay with this period of economic history for a little bit. I'll be the dark cloud behind your silver lining for a moment more. Okay. I just wonder, the violence, the lynchings that occurred during that time, the physical threat is one thing, and it's horrible, but also the disregard for property rights, and that shows up in the Tulsa riots. And how does that disregard for patents and property rights owned or invented by African Americans, does that show up in present day? Is that something we're still dealing with, or have we put to bed that concern about institutional protection for minority innovation?
It depends on which institutions you're talking about. Now, if you're talking about the Patent Office, I would say that that's probably the case. I think that it would be quite difficult to know the race of an inventor because race isn't recorded on a patent. So nobody should know that. Now, everybody does the same thing. And looking at a name, these aren't blindly graded, evaluated. So that, of course, could be going on, but that would be difficult to detect without some sort of systematic investigation of the patent officials. So that would be, I would say that's largely recovered. But there are other institutions whereby property rights might be violated. So if you feel insecure in your neighborhood, you might invest less in your neighborhood. You might not talk to your neighbors as much. And in 1890, it was imperative that people talk to their neighbors because their neighbors were also inventors. They were showing up at the library together. So if you feel alienated from your communities and your networks, then that can be an impediment to participation in the innovative process. So there are some other institutions that might not be as friendly to your moving about. Certainly institutions like banks have a history of systemic racism. And we see that now with the PPP. One reason that a lot of African-American businesses weren't able to access the PPP is because of this existing longstanding systemic racism in big banks. So I would say that property rights, depending on how you define them, might still be in play and might still be an impediment to robust participation in the innovative process.
I think what that comment is so important. I know you got your PhD at Berkeley and the networks and innovation and Jem at Stanford. So you're both out of Silicon Valley.
Exactly, yeah.
Maybe not a coincidence there, but the network is so important to invention, innovation, technology. So that's such a critical part of this discussion. And Jem, I'd like to bring you in here because you date back to World War II, so not quite as far back. But World War II is so meaningful for me. My grandfather was a World War II vet. He actually signed up at 16, not 18, because they didn't keep records on African Americans out of South Carolina, and no one knew the difference. And so he signed up for the Navy. And when he came back, he didn't enjoy the GI Bill, and there wasn't a low-cost mortgage waiting for him in a job. Those benefits that were conferred and built the white middle class were often denied to African Americans and other minorities. World War II is also meaningful to me as an economist because we've just experienced in the second quarter the worst decline since the Great Depression before World War II. But in that era, we've seen this big decline in economic growth. And so I'd like to bring you in both to discuss your view of how inclusion actually built the middle class, because for me, the narrative, it's more policy that built the middle class at the exclusion of certain minority groups and women. So please connect that for me.
Sure. I think the story is maybe a triangulation between the things you just said. I think there was a lot of inclusion that happened in the post-war era in spite of the policy impediments. I mean, it is remarkable the gains that Black men made in that era, given the disadvantages they had coming back with the lack of access to the GI Bill, for example, and the same benefits. Interestingly, I think that what we saw in both the cases of women of all races and then men of color was a real innovative ability to let's sort of take advantage of the opportunities the economy did give them. So during World War II, there's obviously a big war effort, and women were pulled into the workforce fairly dramatically to power the factories and the office jobs and everything else, while men were off fighting. And they didn't all recede after the war ended. In fact, women kept making gains, and between 1950 and 1980, like almost 30 million women joined the workforce. That's largely white women, by the way. Black women had been working outside the home in huge numbers throughout history. But they were also able to sort of fight their way into better jobs because they had shown they could do it. In the same way, Black families were able to fight their way into middle-class neighborhoods, in part because white families were leaving them. I mean, you see the examples in part of my book is set in Queens in the 60s. And, a lot of white families with the benefits of the GI Bill were leaving for Long Island. And in their place, a lot of Black families built up a middle class in Queens. And they did that without those same benefits. But what we saw, though, was that the Civil Rights Act really was this incredibly impactful piece of economic legislation when it passed. It really did make a huge difference, at least briefly, in the opportunities and gains for Black Americans, and again for women across the board. And so policy really can matter. Policy can make a difference. That doesn't always mean policy is fair or doesn't perpetuate more discrimination. And to this day, I think as a legacy of redlining and other things that came after the war, you see that it's much harder for Black families to build wealth in their homes because a majority Black neighborhood is the homes in it are worth less than in a comparable majority white neighborhood. There's great research from Brookings on that a couple of years ago, and it's just it's nothing short of a failure of policy that compounds over time. So I both agree with you that this was a story of some of the things, the policy improvements that helped build the middle class were totally unfair to Black Americans. It's also true that they powered the middle class growth with their own advancements, sort of in spite of that. And I think that's remarkable, and actually just shows even more how much potential we have for unleashing this second wave boom by reducing more of the barriers of discrimination against them.
Boy, Jen, like Dr. Cook, like Lisa, you want to jump to the solution so quickly, but
I know. Sorry.
one more problem question for you, because I really, that's a fantastic answer. So my follow-up is, what changed? When did that resilience of the middle class and building the middle class, both by white America and by minorities, stop its momentum? What happened there?
I think a bunch of things happened. It's always in journalism, you always are like trying to do that, find that one like perfect turning point, like, oh, okay, in 1981 in November, some guys huddle in a parking lot and most of the time that's not true. Thus is the case here. But I think there are some very important signposts along the way. And the short way of saying it is policy changed and the nature of the economy changed and policy didn't keep up. So both those things in tandem. So the Reagan administration rolled back some of the work of the Civil Rights Act. It challenged affirmative action in court. It launched a war on drugs that was, very much stacked against Black men in particular, and led to real setbacks for the economic fortunes of Black America for a generation. And then over time, and then the work was not completed of civil rights because of that. We did not equalize opportunity of education or of work in this country. But then the economy starts to change, and it starts to change in pretty profound ways, away from a production economy toward a service economy, toward a more globalized economy. And I think the advancements in automation and trade, which left a lot of workers behind, were not accompanied by changes in policy to help those workers adapt or to take advantage of the workforce, the skills of the workforce that we have. And I think the example I like to cite the most here, because I think it's just a crucial misstep by policymakers for years now, is that women in this country are hands down are like secret weapon skilled labor force. They are more educated, they are more skilled, and yet they have had declining labor force participation in recent years, and they are not nearly as well represented or as well compensated as you would expect given their education levels. And some, if not much of that, stems from the way we handle childcare policy in this country, that for women with children, we make it difficult for them to have an affordable access to childcare, and we make it very difficult for them to stay on their career tracks and continue to earn. I mean, they just pay a huge penalty, and I think that's a policy failure. And so let's not get into the solutions about that, but if we're asking about what went wrong, I think we have to look at the ways in which we started closing doors of opportunity, the ways in which we did not finish the work of opening new doors to opportunity. And we have to look at the ways in which just the entire landscape changed and policy didn't keep up from the standpoint of those workers who were being left behind.
Right. And I don't think you're going to get any disagreement on this panel that women are a secret weapon in the labor market.
But it's not really even a secret, right? They just are. They're just a weapon.
And thank you. And Dr. Cook, I've heard you talk about hidden figures. So I want to collide these two worlds about an inclusive, a resilient middle class, and then innovation. Because and to do that, I want to piggyback on Jay Powell's comments from at the beginning of the conference, when he said that those low-income workers, the recovery in the jobs market is a 20% lower than where those jobs, those frontline service sector jobs were in February, compared to a 4% decline from other jobs. He also said that though that community of low-income jobs is more likely to be minority and women. And so you also see this instance. I'm one of these women now where my kids are at home as we video conference this, and some women are having to, drop out of the labor market because of COVID-19 and what that has meant to schools. And I also want to just pull in that we're seeing, to Jim's point, more women going into STEM fields, but we're not seeing the corresponding growth in female-owned patents. So in this moment of such a uneven economic recovery that is still early on in the early stages, how does innovation help us as an economy grow and pull these women into front line in terms of innovation and technology?
I can offer one initial thought. One of the biggest solutions that I have been proposing in various policy papers that I put forward recently is improving the workplace environment for women and minorities. So that means reducing discrimination, overt or otherwise, and improving, say, childcare policies. Because one thing that we know is that, especially in laboratories or patent teams where people are working together, women and underrepresented minorities are not pulled in and kept in the same way. And certainly in the visits that I used to have, annual visits to Silicon Valley to talk to my friends about my work, to try to understand some of the results I was getting, they would tell me, and these were all guys, all of them went to Berkeley with me at some point, they would tell me that women were disadvantaged because if they left the team, say at 7 p.m. to go take care of their families, they didn't get the Fruit Loops at 9 o'clock. They didn't get the workplace gossip. They weren't able to have these chance meetings in the hallway that progressed some of their work. And they said flat out that was a detriment. They didn't tell me their role in advancing that or trying to stop that. But anyway, that's beside the point. But I'm saying that this seems to be a fairly regular phenomenon that women and underrepresented minorities aren't supported once they get into these roles. And we know that they're often not in technical roles, say in tech firms. So there's just got to be a broader thinking about who can contribute. And that's the whole point of my research. You want to make sure that you have a maximum flow of ideas. And you also want to make sure that you're not leaving money on the table. So this is what I was struck by. I have some research that says that co-ed patent teams or mixed gender patent teams are more productive than single sex male or single sex female. So why on earth would you allow, and this is transitive, so this suggests any kind of diversity, lots of diversity in general. Why would you ever not have diverse teams? It means that you're not being a good steward of the resources of the firm. So, I would, if I were a shareholder, I would question, your abilities as a manager if you're leaving money on the table. So I would suggest that we reassess how we're holding accountable our shareholders, our managers at every level. We've got to change the environment from top to bottom, from CEO, from founders who are trying to get money from VCs and are being underfunded, to those who are just trying to be graduate students on patent teams at the graduate level. We got to do it everywhere.
Fantastic. And I will now accept your movement to solutions. That's perfectly said. Jem, could you weigh in? What resonates to you about Dr. Cook's response in terms of maybe not tech and innovation, but rebuilding the middle class? What have you learned in your reporting in terms of solutions?
I actually would love to riff on her tech and innovation response because I think it's crucial. It's the missing piece of what's made this particular era of the middle class so disappointing. At past times in American history, the sort of destruction of good jobs for a particular class of workers has ended up yielding way to the creation of better jobs that make better use of those workers, the move from farm to factory being the most notable of those. And what we've had in this destruction of, in particular, manufacturing, but other sort of middle skill jobs in offices or in blue collar fields is a devaluation of workers. They have not, for the most part, gone on to better jobs. Better jobs have not appeared. And so I think there's an innovation reason for that. I think that we may, in fact, as a society, be underinvesting in the people who could be creating the companies that would be creating the jobs that put those people to better use. And I'm a human labor optimist and think that there are still wonderful higher callings for people who lost those jobs over time. And I think in this case that the answer is clear who we're underinvesting in. It's women are criminally underinvested in by venture capitalists, and whether it's female-only firms or founding teams or mixed gender teams, they're like 15% of all venture capital, and the rest just goes to teams who are all dudes. And that doesn't seem like a normal or distribution of funding to me. And I think if we look at across at other types of funding for startups or just small businesses, it is still disproportionately going to white men. And I think that is a lost opportunity for the sort of job and industry creation that would put those workers back to work and in a way that is positive and growing for the middle class.
Great. And there's a question from our viewers, and I remind the people watching, if you want to type a question in the chat, we'll try to get to it. But this one really follows up on that comment. Does addressing inequality focus on addressing equality of opportunity, or does it try to create equality of outcome? And it's to either of you.
You want to start, Lisa? I have thoughts, but I want to hear yours.
Okay, I'll start. I think as an economist, I have been trained to think mostly about equality of opportunity. We have watched what that has produced. It hasn't produced equality of outcomes, of equity of outcomes, because if you're providing the opportunity, what you're saying is that the pipeline is fine. The path to getting there is fine. And that's the opposite of what I heard from Black inventors, Black founders, Black employees in tech companies when I have been investigating them. They speak to barriers at each stage, a leaky pipeline in the first place. So, we have this well-known research whereby it's an audit study. Students inquire with professors about doing a PhD in that person's field. And you can only guess what happens. And this is the issue. We're socialized in a certain way. Not only were predictably women and minorities emails were not answered, so they weren't taken seriously. So this is pathway to a particular discipline and broadly across disciplines. But there wasn't much difference between the white professors and the women and minority professors, right? So this is a systemic problem. So I would say that we have to work first on the equality of opportunity, but we've got to understand where that breaks down. And I would argue that representation actually matters. I am elated that there are 4 women and 1 man who've been elected to help lead the American Economic Association as of yesterday. And I see that everywhere, because what I understand is that role models make a difference. What the state of California has said, for example, is 1 woman on a board should actually make a difference. At least 1 woman on a board should make a difference, because it's made a difference in Europe. So I would like to see more of this. And what that is saying is that equality of opportunity is not enough. That is an outcome. They're targeting specifically an outcome. And I would agree with that. And, you know, I'll let Jim talk, but we should get back to, since he and I went to the premier universities in the state of California, there's something specific about Prop 209 that has had generational effects in terms of deterring. And these are the places where there is the most recruitment of people in the tech sector. So I'll have something to say about that, but why don't you go ahead, Tim?
And I would like to point out that I only have a bachelor's degree. So I think that is, it's not like I got a doctorate from one of the premier institutions, but I appreciate the chance to be able to talk about this as well. And I think about it a little bit differently, but I think in a very related way. I think equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome is a thing that often gets tossed around in the political discourse by people who want to shut down the talk of equality. The idea is, oh, if you're insisting on equality of outcome, you're basically saying everyone has to make the same amount of money all the time. And obviously that's not how a capitalist system works, where people should be, you know, rewarded for you know, producing more, doing better, whatever. But I think equality of opportunity is a really easy way to get out of a lot of difficult conversations. It's like too many people just treat it as, well, if you're let in the door, then that is equality of opportunity. I mean, I used to, you know, in high school, I played basketball on the basketball team, and I used to play a lot of pickup basketball in the summers. And, you know, there were a couple of games where you'd go to play basketball and you'd get into the game. Everybody, you wait in line, you get into the game. But there were a bunch of guys out there who were really good friends, and they wouldn't pass you the ball. So is that equality of opportunity? I got in the game, but I just ran up and down the court for, you know, 10 minutes, and then that was that. I think for women and for workers of color in America, equality of opportunity is much more than just, are you getting, you know, as many slots at a university? Are you getting as many job interviews? Which in so many cases they're still not. But it's, are you getting promoted? Are you getting trained? Are you getting the same investment from your manager? And are you getting the same opportunities to climb all the way up the ladder? Are you getting the same meetings with venture capitalists and the same amount of funding? You know, that's just not the case. So I think if we had true equality of opportunity, not only to get in the door, but to work your way all the way through the system and succeed, then that would produce what I think a lot of people would consider a sort of equality of outcome, or something much closer to that.
I love that analogy of running back and forth on the court and not having little to show for it. I think that's really resonant. At a time when corporations are starting to step up, or at least verbally announcing their commitment to improve minority hiring, female hiring, we also see an administration that has recently decided to go to these firms, Microsoft, Wells Fargo, even Yale University, and kind of challenge these new commitments to diversity. And so that's why circling back to Prop 209 in California is a good next place to go. Dr. Cook, I know you wanted to say a few words on that. Why is it so important? What role does it play in the discussion we're having right now?
So first, I'd like to say to Jim, most patents come from BA holders, right? So I'm not excluding you. So they're recruiting at every level from Berkeley and Stanford, and that turns out to be important for Prop 209, which banned affirmative action in California. And this is it was a travesty at the time. It sent a lot of talented African Americans and Latinos to elite universities on the East Coast. So California actually lost out on that talent. But there's a graduate student, Zach Bleemer at Berkeley, who's looked at the long-term effects of Prop 209. And what we see is fewer people completing college, so going someplace else and not completing college, and then earning much less than they would have earned had they completed college or had they gone to an elite university like Berkeley. And other colleges in the UC system have adopted the top 10% rule, top 10% of high schools in California, so they have a lot more diversity. Berkeley decided not to do that. So I'm going to talk to my alma mater, because what we see is this dramatic change. And this is where tech folks are being recruited from. So they don't have the pipeline. So they don't even have the equality of opportunity. So I think that's one of the things that needs to be changed, along with adding underrepresented minorities to boards as we're adding women to boards. And I'd like to see that kind of law that is present in California in all states in the country, because we've seen better outcomes with respect to opportunity and outcomes when women are on these boards in Europe.
There's a question here that I think is important from the viewers. They're all great questions, but this one on the digital divide. We're seeing that show up as we try to educate our children from home, and college students are quarantining essentially and going online. How does the digital divide impact education, and how would that widen inequality in the middle class? And I'll just, while giving you some time to think, I recently, yesterday, saw this Wall Street Journal article on tricks for helping your kids learn online. And they included things like having 2 monitors and having the kid have both his computer and his iPad in order to facilitate learning, and setting timers on his Alexa so that Alexa can help remind him to log on into class. I'm like, wow, this is a wealthy, connected family who has an Alexa, 2 monitors, an iPad, and a computer to give to their child. So when we talk about the digital divide, it's real and it's present. So just throwing that in. But either of you want to take that question?
I certainly will. I taught this summer. I direct the AEA summer program, and we had to quickly get online. Typically, it does start at the end of May and goes through the end of July. And we quickly had to learn how to go online. And our students are from underrepresented minority communities. And these are places where the digital divide can be large. What we know is that African Americans and Latinos disproportionately use their phones for broadband at home. So if they are using their phones for broadband, they aren't using 2 computer monitors. They're not using the fastest cable available. And I'm from the country. I was in 4-H. I can only imagine being in my hometown and having to do homework from any university in my hometown. I'd have to drive up to McDonald's, or drive up to Shoney's or the library, and hope that the Wi-Fi actually worked there. I think this is going to have lasting ramifications, and this pandemic has exposed some of the underinvestment that we've done in this country. We have not invested in rural broadband, And we have not invested in closing the digital divide within cities. So we've got a lot of work to do. This has exposed us. So hopefully we'll do something about it and do something about it quickly.
Right.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think if you were to design a recession to hurt the sort of both the most vulnerable Americans and the ones who are most critical to the future of our middle class, you design basically this one. You would have a virus that has health impacts that disproportionately affect Black and brown communities across the country. You would have job losses that disproportionately affect sort of the frontline low wage workers in the economy who can't work from home. And then you would have long-term like human capital, like detrimental effects of just like radically upending school in a way that makes it in particular disadvantages lower income kids of color. And it's just, at every single level, the recession has just been brutal for those workers. And I think that is, it's unfortunately been predictable. We were writing about this back in the spring, that this is already shaping up and that it was going to keep being like that depending on how policy played out. And policy has not been responsive enough to prevent or to mitigate those disasters. And so, I worry about that a lot. I mean, not just a sort of a temporary setback of all the Americans who have been, knocked off their feet by this recession, but the long-term setbacks that we can't even imagine right now. I think it could be really, really damaging and was entirely foreseeable, which is really unfortunate.
Well,
if I can just add one more historic statistic to this. Women are back where they were in 1987 with respect to labor force participation. We had the most dramatic drop since the post-World War II period in women's participation. And this is across the board. So we're talking about pathways to the middle class. I completely agree with Jim that this would be a recession that would harm pathways to the middle class for a long time. And that would include small businesses. If entrepreneurship is a tried and true path to the middle class and to wealth accumulation, what we see is this. First of all, there are 50 white entrepreneurs for every Black entrepreneur, but for all entrepreneurs, all small entrepreneurs, this is having a devastating effect. And if we talk about long-term growth, a lot of our innovative ideas come from the smallest firms and from the newest firms. And if they didn't have access to PPP, then what we're doing is shutting down ideas prematurely. They don't have access to these big banks. You don't have access to PPP in the way others did. So this is definitely the perfect storm for the worst outcomes for the middle class.
Yeah, and we only have a few minutes. I want to leave you both with your best policy outcome, best policy solution given the moment. But I would like to note that another pathway to middle class is homeownership. And for African Americans, we're at the same level of home ownership almost as we were in 1968 when housing discrimination was legal. So a lot of things are going backwards instead of forwards, and this pandemic has made them even worse. Policy solutions though, Jim, I know you talked to a variety of people across the political spectrum, as you assess the moment. And I know reporters have a knack for knowing what's next, not just what's now. Where do you think the biggest bang for our policy dollar resides for the middle class?
I mean, I'm going to go with the short-term answer is very easy. I think we've got to get the virus under control. You need some sort of a test, like a much more comprehensive national testing system, therapeutics, like everything for the middle class right now depends on getting this pandemic under control to a much greater degree than it is and giving people confidence to have a real, fully functioning economy again. Medium term, I think it's childcare. I think that solving the childcare crisis and really like getting sort of widely available, affordable childcare with policy levers on the supply and the demand side is critical to reversing that decline back into the 1987 female LFP levels.
Terrific. And Dr. Cook, I'll let you have the last word on this. What is the biggest moonshot policy solution that you see?
Okay, I don't have a moonshot.
Okay,
I just have,
really, your
if we
favorite.
address workplace environment from top to bottom, from the CEO level, recruiting more women and African Americans and other underrepresented minorities at every single level, and making sure that they are mentored, that they are promoted, that they wind up in these positions, that they serve as role models for others, so that we unleash these ideas. Unleashing the ideas is the way to unleash the economy. So we need to do everything we can to make sure that that happens.
That is the perfect note to end this panel on. Unleashing ideas is the key to unleashing the economy. Thank you both for this really exciting, interesting conversation. I hope there's more to come on this, because I think innovation is a missing discussion when it comes to the resilience of the middle class and inclusion in economic growth. So thank you both for your time.
Thank you.